everyone. Once again, I'm Dr. Heather Hatch at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, and I'd like to welcome you to our live talk of the day. So once again, we've dropped back doing these a little bit from every day a week to doing it twice a week. So now we're doing it on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Next week, I think we're going to be doing a talk on taphonomy, which is what happens to artifacts after they become part of the archaeological record. And also, we hopefully will be having a guest lecture from Dr. Neil Ferris, who is our Canadian chair, our Lawson Chair of Canadian Archaeology here at the museum. So he's been working on preparing a presentation on a couple of sites that he worked on when he was working with the Ministry of Culture here in Ontario. So hopefully we'll have that for you next week, probably on Thursday. But for today, we're here to talk about we're here to talk about the Norton Site, which is a site that's located in London, Ontario. Before I get started on that, though, I would like to once again just remind you that if you have been watching and enjoying these talks, we would really appreciate it if you would be able to drop us a few dollars through our donation page, and I or one of my co-workers here will put up a link to that here in the comments shortly. So if you go to the page, it's just that big yellow donate button that takes you directly to PayPal. Is probably the easiest way to donate. There's also some information about how you might want to mail us a check, but since we're not really working on site, it's difficult for us to get the mail at the moment, but we'll get to that eventually. Excuse me, just scratch my nose. Of course, my dog starts barking immediately. Anyway, I'm just going to drop that comment link, or that donation link, just in the comments on the feed here today. Hopefully my sister will be able to get my dog to be a little more quiet. In any case, as I said, we're talking about the Norton Site today, which is located actually in Kensal Park, which is one of several parks in London that cover an interesting archaeological past. So in the case of Kensal Park, which is in West London, it's built on top of a 15th century Indigenous village. And unfortunately, I'm not able to speak to you from Kensal Park today. Everything's been closed down, and also the systems or transit and so forth to get out there are a little bit convoluted. So I'm unfortunately having to talk to you about it from my home. But if you are from London, you've ever been out that way, just the next time you're in the area, sort of put your mind sort of back in time a little bit. Try to imagine what it might have been like about 600 years ago. So this was first recorded as an archaeological site by William Winterberg in the 1920s, and I think you might have heard his name before if you've been following along some of these other talks. So it was actually recorded in the report that he wrote about the Lawson site when he was talking about other archaeological sites that were in the area. So he didn't really discover it, much like I've said, a lot of these things weren't necessarily discovered by archaeologists. They were known to local people, but he recorded it in this report, and so that's really the first reference we have to it in the archaeological record, and to it being known as an archaeological site. The site is named for the Norton family, who had been farming in the area and had just acquired that land when Winterberg was writing that report. So that's where the name comes from. So in 1987, there was a proposal to construct a new water main in the park, because there's an associated sort of sewage treatment plant there. And so that triggered an archaeological assessment. So we've talked a little bit about that before too. So whenever there's any kind of development in an area, you have to sort of investigate whether or not it's going to impact any archaeological remains. And the answer there was yes. And then I believe in 1992, the fieldwork moved forward to investigate that more in depth. So it was surveyed initially by Archaeological Services Inc., or ASI. They found some artifacts that were really similar to the sorts of things that had been found at the Lawson site. So further investigation in the area revealed 9 longhouses, or part of 9 longhouses. There was a palisade, so like a wooden fencing that encircled the village, and then 1 midden. And this all dated to about 1400 to 1450 AD, so about 600 years ago now. So there's a lot more features that were found on this site. We've talked about features too, so these are the visible evidence of archaeological remains, so like post holes, that sort of thing, pits that people were burying refuse in, also things like hearths and ash pits that are associated with those. So we found a lot more features than artifacts on this site. So there wasn't really a lot of artifactual evidence, and probably this is due to the fact that the site was known and it had been collected by people who were familiar with its location. Some of the artifacts that were found were pretty neat. So there was some flake stone tools and ground stone tools and ceramics, but there's also some sort of like worked bone items that were kind of cool, like awls, which are used for working leather. They're basically for punching through thick materials in preparation for sewing. There's also beads, and there was this sort of weird perforated antler object that was recovered that they don't really have a good idea of what it was maybe used for. Like it might have been a sickle or something. It's an antler that's sort of been smoothed out into a curved shape. It had 2 holes drilled through it, so you could potentially attach it to something. We don't really 100% know what it was for, but it was all the extra tines on the antler had been smoothed down, so it just formed this sort of nice sickle shape. So that was a kind of a neat thing that they found. But on the whole, there was not really a lot of artifacts that were recovered. So it was because it was excavated as part of a project, they didn't actually dig up the full village. So only the parts that were going to be impacted. Oh, so I have a question here from Donald Popcan, which is, what were the beads made out of? In this case, the beads that I'm talking about were actually made out of bone. So a lot of them were made out of parts of deer toes, which is something that we find pretty commonly on archaeological sites from this period. Is a lot of bone beads. So they're made out of that, or they're made out of short, hollow bone tubes. Also, we find those kinds of beads as well. I don't think they found those hollow tube bones on the Norton site. It was more the sort of the deer toe style of beads. In any case, as I was saying, they didn't excavate the whole village, just the parts that were going to be impacted by the project, so by putting in this water main associated with the sewage treatment plant. So this was still enough to recognize the significance of the village, and it was eventually designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, and also included on the Canadian Register of Historic Places. So it's been recognized as an important and interesting archaeological site that is there. But it also means that because we didn't excavate the whole village, that we don't really have a full picture of everything that's going on there. They do think there might still be archaeological remains sort of in the area, but a lot of that space has been impacted by erosion down into what used to be an old bank of the Thames River, and also by development sort of just around the park as well. So we don't really have the full village left. But unfortunately, I'm going to try and talk about some things here. I don't have a map I can show you. I don't have good technology. Print one out maybe, but if you want to look it up, you can put Norton Site Ontario Archaeology into the internet search of your choice, and you'll find up some more information, including some articles that I think are in the public or publicly accessible. And you can also read about it and see a site plan of the Norton site and the parts of it that were excavated if you go to historicplaces.ca and search for Norton. So it's registered there as the Norton Attawandaron site. And I thought that this would be a good point to talk about some terminology that we encounter. So in archaeology, we're always learning new things, questioning things that we think we do know. And this leads to a lot of changing of the ways we talk about the past from how we've done things previously. And the problem is that sometimes these old ways that we've done things sort of stick around. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the term Attawandaron. So this is a name that's been applied to Indigenous peoples living in longhouses who inhabited parts of southwestern Ontario about 500, 600 years ago. It's even in the address for the museum, so our address is 1600 Attawandaron Road, and that's because the Lawson site, which is associated with the museum, has been associated with this Attawandaron group. But where the name comes from is actually a little bit more complicated. So it's actually a term for a group of Indigenous peoples that were living in a series of villages around the Grand River in the early 16th century, so about 200 years after the Norton site. And we know about this term and we know about these people through records of French Jesuit missionaries who were primarily working with Huron-Wendat groups up further north in Ontario. So there's about 200 years and 150 kilometers between the Attawandaron people that are being recorded in these Jesuit relations and their texts, and the people that we're talking about at the Norton site or the Lawson site. So we don't really know if they're the same people, or if they would have seen themselves as that way. There's some Archaeologists have assumed that there's a connection between the people who are living sort of in the London area and then in the Grand River area, but we don't actually know that. And those lines of evidence are really, they're not very strong. So we assume that there's a connection, or we have in the past, but we're not really confident enough to be able to take that name, Attawandaron, that we know from the Jesuits who were talking to a different people. They weren't even really interacting that much with the Attawandaron directly. So that's not even necessarily a name that those people had for themselves at the time. So for us to take that name that we don't even know if the people who were being written about in that time period 200 years later would have applied to themselves, and take that to apply it to people who were living 200 years in the past, 150 kilometers away, is a little bit tenuous. So we're trying to move away from using that term and applying it to the people that were living in this area. But it's difficult. As I said, it's something that archaeologists have used, and it's an association that we have made in the past, and it's kind of enduring. So we see it in things like older plaques that have been erected on these sites. So I believe it's actually on the Norton Site, the bronze plaque that commemorates the site. It's in our street name, and it comes up in a lot of other places. But that term is it's really about a questionable association. So it's something we're trying to move away from. If you see it and you encounter it in other kinds of contexts, just keep that in your mind, that we don't really know that like who that name applied to, and whether or not we can really use it to talk about the people who were living here. Moving on from that, let's talk a little bit more about the Norton site itself. So what did they find? So as I was saying, the investigation was prompted by this water pipeline project associated with the sewage treatment plant that's there, and they only really investigated what was in the path of that development. So we know that the site itself is on a plateau, so it overlooks what was a branch of the Thames River. The river has sort of moved back from there. It's on the southern bank of what would have been that river. So like the Lawson site itself, it's very high up above the river, but unlike Lawson, it's right on that main waterway, or what would have been a main waterway at the time, whereas Lawson is on some sort of smaller waterways that would have linked up to the Thames. So it's a little bit more removed from that direct transportation and water resource. So part of the village that was right along that bank has already been destroyed by erosion, and also partly by the development related to the water treatment plant, so which is a little bit further north. So what was excavated, though, seems to be part of the northernmost remaining edge of the site. So if you imagine you've got your river, or your old riverbank running here, it would have been just a little bit. And if the site is right to the south here, this makes a lot of sense, I'm sure, to everybody who's watching at home. So it would have been basically the northernmost edge of what was left of the site that they were excavating. And so they basically took like about a 10-meter strip across the top of that village is what they excavated. The southern edge of the village, so what would have been further away from the bank of the river, has really mostly been lost in the development of like the subdivision that surrounds the park. So we don't really have that anymore, or if there's other deposits, they haven't been investigated archaeologically. So when I say that they found the remains of 9 longhouses, they didn't really investigate the full longhouses. So what they're really looking at is what they encountered when they dug that strip that was about 10 meters across. And it just happened that excavated cut across these particular longhouses that were right along that northern edge of the slope. So there could have been more further south, probably not further north, because as we know, that would have been running right into the bank of the river. And we know that these houses were very close together. So there was no more than about 1.5 to 2 meters between these houses. So for houses, that's pretty closely packed. Especially when you keep in mind that the houses themselves are about 6 meters wide. So you've got a 6 meter wide house and like about a 1.5 meter space and another 6 meter wide house. It's quite densely packed area. They're also all in basically the same alignment, so they run north to south, so they're like directly facing right into the bank of the river there. And so what we can say about this is that they were probably all built around the same time. So it's also possible that the whole site was like that, where you just have these really closely spaced rows of longhouses that are all parallel to each other. But it's also possible that these ones are built the way that they were because they represent some sort of particular relationship between the people who are living in these houses that we happen to encounter. So as I said, they're all about the same width, so about 6 meters. We don't know how long the longhouses were. They range quite a lot. Some of them could be like 10 meters, some could be... there are some later sites in Ontario where longhouses are like 100 meters long. They're ridiculous. I don't think we have evidence that the ones at Norton were quite that large. I don't know if there would have been space, but they were certainly longer than the 10-meter swath that we encountered. So maybe 15, 20, we don't really know. Yes, a comment, density is a huge factor in pandemics. We are learning from our... Yes, so housing density and lifestyle density in these villages was really... it's an interesting thing that archaeologists do try to look at. Where we have the evidence, we can try and sort of extrapolate how many people we think were living in these houses, and they could be quite densely packed in some contexts. Generally speaking, and this is not necessarily applied to Norton specifically, but generally speaking, when we think of a lot of these houses as having central hearths, so a fireplace in the middle, and on either side you might have a family that was living there, and those families could be anywhere from like 2 to 5 people. So some of these longhouses were quite densely populated. They could have hundreds of people living in one particular house. And so the houses themselves represent different kinds of social units that are keeping these people together and keeping them interacting as a group within that space as well. So at Norton, again, for 3 of these 9 houses, what we have is really just the ends of the houses. So just like if you can imagine a longhouse is sort of built like a long cigar shape, what we've got is really just the tip of that cigar on either end. So on a couple of cases, we really don't have very much of those houses at all. And then for the other 6 of those 9, we have basically that swath that goes right through the middle of the house. So we can say that, again, they were at least 9 to 10 meters long, just based on the width of the trench that was excavated archaeologically. And we know that also that there was a palisade that enclosed those houses. So there was like a single row of fencing on either side of each the houses were sort of spaced in the middle, and on either side there was a fence, and it was just a single row fence, so it wasn't really necessarily a really extensive defensive feature. It wasn't really convoluted. It was really just one line of fencing that ran around the outside of the village at that point. In later archaeological sites like Lawson, we see a much more convoluted palisades where there's multiple layers of palisades. There might be some more structure in between them to make them more maze-like. But that's really not what we're seeing here at the Norton site, which is about 100 years earlier than Lawson. It's really much more simple, just like a fence around the village. And that could have been in like some sort of nod towards defensive, and it might have just been to define like this is where the village is versus this is the outside space. So we don't really actually know why these palisades are being built. We have a couple of different theories. We do assume that it did go around the whole village because that's the pattern that we do see at other villages from this period, and generally speaking, similar villages. I also want to talk a little bit more about 3 of the houses. I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but just to give you, again, a sense of sort of what we do know about these houses, and how we think about them archaeologically. So I'm just going to talk about houses 1, 2, and 3 a little bit because they have some interesting features and connections. So once again, this is all based on just the features that were found. So we can find the post molds that were left that give us the outline of the shape of those houses. And we can see the features inside that give us a clue about how that space was being used. So we can see the hearths. They're pretty easy to tell. We can also see related ash pits, so there's where they're cleaning out the hearths mostly. And then we can see other kinds of activity areas as well. And these are basically just stains in the ground. So if you imagine like there's a flat surface and you might see some like little darker holes that sort of outline where the posts were that held up that longhouse. So we see the outside structure of the house. We also see usually there's, in the Norton site, a central line of posts as well that provide some extra internal support. And that's common to all of the houses at Norton. In some of them, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll just talk about, I'm just going to get to house 1 then. So this was a house where they found the most features. So it seems like it was a really busy and active space. So there's no internal partitions. Sometimes in longhouses you might find places that sort of divide the space that cut across it, or you might find like lines of bunks that run across it on either side. And sometimes at the entrances and on either end, you might also find just a division there that sort of demarcates that entry space. So we don't really see that. What we see is mostly an open area with a line of hearths down the middle and a lot of different features associated with those hearths, which is why I say it seemed like it was really busy. I think there was a lot of stuff going on. On the edges, there's no bunk platform, so sometimes we see where people have created basically like platforms for sleeping and taking for other kinds of activities and storage and so forth that line the outside edges of the longhouses, and we don't see that in House 1 at Norton. However, because we don't see any features in this area, it still seems like the space was being sort of socially defined as being not for the kinds of activities that are going to generate these other features that we're seeing. So even though we don't see the bunks, we can say that space still was being socially sort of managed. So it did have other kinds of activities happening there. So it was still sort of socially ordered space. We also know that there was, getting a little bit lost here. Yeah. So we know that there was an entrance facing House 2 in this area, and between Houses 1 and House 2 there was a midden, so like a garbage dump, basically between these two houses. And after the village was abandoned, it kind of overspilled a little bit once it was no longer really being tended or managed, and it sort of spilled a little bit into both Houses 1 and 2. So we know that it was used by people from House 1 for sure, and we think also by people who were living in House 2. So this was sort of a shared garbage dump between these people. So they were just dumping their trash, again, in that very narrow space between the houses. So again, we said it's about 1.5 to 2 meters between any of these houses. And they're just accumulating all that trash between those two houses in that space. So unlike House 1, House 2 didn't really have a lot of hearths, or it had fewer features overall. So whatever they were doing in there probably didn't need as much fire. Maybe people were living there in a warmer time of year. Maybe they were just using it for different kinds of activities. Or maybe it's just that the hearths where there would have been more activity, like we saw in House 1, was in a different part of the house that was not excavated. So what features there are in House 2 are really more all along the western edge. So I didn't really give you a sense of where these houses were. So if you imagine that the north bank is sort of closer to you and the south bank is further to me, so then, I guess this is all reversed, but the eastern edge for me is on this side and the western edge is over here. There's one house that's House 6 that's right alongside the palisade. And I don't know how they got numbered. I'm assuming just based on the order in which they were found. So we're going to go as House 6, then House 1, 2, 3, and so on. So these three houses that I'm talking about are all right in order, and they go from east to west. And again, this is probably weird for you because everything's in reverse image, but they progress across the site from east to west. And again, they're all in that same north-south alignment. So House 1 is directly west, House 2 is directly west of House 1, and House 3 is directly west of House 2. So when I say that all of the features in House 2 were more along the western side, so that means that they're closer to where that boundary is with House 3. House 3 is sort of similar to House 2 in that we do have some evidence, and then a lot of the features again are more along the western side of things. We do have evidence of a bunk line, so again there's just this another line of posts that indicate that maybe there was a platform there that people were using for sleeping or storage, or both, that were sort of along the eastern side of House 3, so closer to where House 2 was. But what's really interesting about these two houses is not really anything in and of themselves, but between them, there is this other feature, this sort of keyhole-shaped feature in that 1.5 to 2 meter wide space between houses 2 and 3. And this is a kind of feature that we see a lot on these sites that we as archaeologists have really interpreted as maybe being something like a sweat lodge. So it's semi-subterranean, it's dug into the earth. There's evidence that there was structure that probably would have gone over top of it, so it would have been covered by like bark or some sort of maybe hide roof structure. And usually when we find these features, these sort of sweat lodge features, or these features that have been interpreted as sweat lodges, we see entrances from a particular house. So you would have a house, and then you would have inside that house an entrance to that sweat lodge area that was dug sort of into a semi-subterranean, like dug out into the earth beside it. But in this case, that's not what we see. We see its main entrance is actually between the two houses, between houses 2 and 3. And so usually that entry point would give you control over that space, so it gives you an ability to control who's using it, who's accessing it, but in this case it's more of a shared space. There is some evidence in both House 2 and House 3 that there was previously sort of ramped entrances that led down into this from either of these two houses, but those entrances were closed up in favor of having this more communal entry point between the two houses. And so this is one of the reasons, like this particular configuration of the houses and this sweat lodge feature is one of the reasons that archaeologists think that there might have been some connections between, like social connections and community connections between the people who were living in these houses at the northern end of the site. So rather that this particular group of 9 houses that were all in alignment up at the north end of the site, that were so closely together, all in the same physical, like north-south alignment, that there might have been some sort of social connection there, and that it's not necessarily the case that all of the village, the houses in the village that we don't have, they might not have been in the same kind of configuration, they might not have been as close or as densely constructed. So that's just sort of an interesting feature of the Norton site that I thought was worth mentioning. First of all, that we have this sweat lodge, which is sort of a communal, like ritual, like social community focused ritual space. That it has these connections between these two separate longhouses. So I don't want to get too much into the artifactual finds at Norton. First of all, there's really not that much. And second of all, it's difficult to sort of talk about what they mean to a general audience when you don't have sort of the big, broader picture of everything that's going on in Ontario. So if I say, well, they found some of, this particular pottery type, it's not necessarily going to have a lot of meaning to you. So I'm going to try to talk about more what those artifacts say in terms of interpretation. So there's not really enough artifacts to draw a lot of really strong conclusions anyway. So for example, they found probably about 450 or so pieces of lithic debitage, so stoneworking, evidence of stoneworking to make stone tools of different types. But only 9 of those were actually what we would consider formal tools. And we could say, aha, this was a projectile point. We know basically what it was for. So again, when we say there's not a lot of evidence to make these kinds of interpretations, that's what I mean. So we found a lot of stuff, but it's not necessarily stuff that helps us make broader interpretations. We can say that we do say that there were areas where it seems like people were making or resharpening these tools around hearths in House 1 and 2, and an even more concentrated site of tool making related activities in House 6. But a lot of the finds that were made were just sort of scattered across the surface of the village and not necessarily in like specific areas, or a lot of them were actually found in the midden that I mentioned between House 1 and 2, so they were just sort of thrown in the trash. So we know that some of those, as I was saying, some of those were found around hearths, and we know that fire can help make chert, which is the material, the stone material that a lot of these are being made out of. It can make them harder. So it might have been the reason that those activities were taking place around the hearths. It also could have just been because if you were inside in these longhouses, there's not necessarily a lot of light, so it might have just been easier to see. The people who were living here also had ceramic pottery. This is definitely a pottery having period of time in southern Ontario. So they had pots. They also had pipes as well. They also made tools out of bones, like the beads that we discussed earlier, and awls again, and these sorts of tools. We also know a little bit about the lifestyles of the people who lived at Norton from other kinds of evidence, like faunal and floral remains. So we know that they hunted a lot of deer. Most of the tools we found are made out of deer, but also a lot of the other faunal remains, so bone remains from the site, is just very heavily represented with deer. There was also some small game and fish as well. The report that I was reading about this said that they didn't really do a lot of the kinds of analysis that would find a lot of finer fish bones, so that fish might be underrepresented in the sample that we do have, since we know that they were living right on the river there. It would have been pretty easy at different times of year to catch a lot of different fish resources. We also have the floral remains. So I talked on Monday about archaeobotany, and this is sort of where this is coming in. So we found most of the typical domesticated plants that you find in southern Ontario. So they had maize, sunflower, beans, and tobacco. They didn't find any squash, but again, they didn't really take a lot of samples for flotation, which is what would have really turned up a lot of this material. So I think they took 18 samples across the entire site. But nevertheless, we know that in addition to these, we also have evidence that they were using other kinds of wild food sources like berries. And then finding them that indicates that despite the fact that we know that these people were practicing agriculture, they were cultivating these other plants, they were still relying on these more seasonal resources as well, or making use of them, even if they were relying on them. We also know from the kinds of woods that they were burning in their hearths that the forest was probably a mixture of like maple and beech, which is a kind of forest that sort of colonizes like disturbed areas over time. And we also know that there were disturbed areas around the settlement from the other kinds of seeds that were being found, just sort of the kinds of weeds that get basically everywhere. We found enough of these to say that there's just sort of a lot of disturbed areas, which is really what you would expect around a village, especially if people were clearing a lot of land for agriculture. So the artifacts, along with the features and these other kinds of finds, can help us put Norton a little bit into context in terms of what we're seeing in the London area. So we know that these villages were not occupied for more than about 30 years at a time before they were moved, or before the people moved, and that we can see how some of these communities are moving across the landscape. Now, unfortunately, with Norton, it's a little bit more difficult because, first of all, we don't have the full village, so we don't have a real good picture of everything that was happening there. But also, Norton is sort of situated like in the middle of a bunch of these other little communities. So we don't really know which one it might have been associated with. But that is something that, on the whole, we can often do with these village sites. There's also not a lot of other, like a lot of these larger villages like Norton had smaller sites that were associated with them. So for example, with the Lawson site, again, which is about 100 years later, we have small hamlets, like smaller little villages with only a couple of long houses that were probably associated with supporting the agricultural production that supported the main village. So, helping tend those fields a little bit further out from the main village. Also campsites where they would have been procuring particular local resources. So we don't have a lot of those that are associated with Norton specifically, and that's probably just because that area really is quite developed, and it's in the middle of a subdivision, and it really kind of was built up a bit already when people started doing this kind of archaeological work. There are some smaller campsites that are in the broader area, so around Sifton Bog in in London. There's a lot of these smaller archaeological sites that we think might be related to Norton, and it's possible that, again, that we've just lost some of these other ones that would have helped us get a broader picture. Temporally speaking, so again, this is about 100 years before Lawson, and we can see that the palisade is less elaborate, so that's something I mentioned earlier, so it's really just like a single row of fencing around the site, whereas at some of these later sites you see it become a lot more elaborate, and probably but in the later sites probably did have more of an association with defense. Lawson, as I said, is also placed on a tributary off of a main river, so it's not right on a main waterway, whereas Norton is. So it's just sort of overall a picture that's less committed to being in a defensible location. So even though it's still up high above the river, there's just all these other sort of features that go along with it that say that's really maybe not as much of a concern. Again, there wasn't a whole lot of different pottery recovered from Norton, so again, there's just not a lot of artifacts that go along with all the features and and the houses that we found. And so there's a diversity, but it's not the same kind of diversity that we see at Lawson, where we're seeing pottery types that are associated, or that we think are associated with different people, different cultural groups. So there's not the same kinds of trade here, there's not the same kind of people movement that we see at later sites. So it just really gives you a sort of different picture of the relationships that people at Norton had to other communities in that were in Southern Ontario at the time. So whether or not those were peaceful or whatever was happening on in the early 15th century versus what was happening 100 years later, there are some big changes that are happening that we can see just in the ways that people are arranging their villages, what they're building around them, where they're locating them. And so we can see that those changes haven't really started to happen in this period in the early 15th century, in the early 1400s. So today, obviously, the site is quite different. Kensal Park is basically a big soccer field. So if you're ever out there, as I was saying, just take a minute to sort of think about what this would have looked like when there was all these different longhouses standing there, quite a dense population of people living there, and just the kinds of resources that you would have seen, like the agricultural fields that would have been around the site, and just the kinds of activities that you can maybe imagine people doing there. So just think about that maybe next time that once our parks reopen, next time you go out there, if you're ever in the area, just sort of think about what life would have been like in these places 600 years ago. So I hope that has been interesting, and that's the Norton Site again, which is located in what is now Kensal Park in London, Ontario. And then again, next week, I think we're going to be talking about taphonomy, and then also hopefully having a guest lecture from our Lawson Chair of Canadian Archaeology. And I hope that you will join us for both of those next week on Tuesday and Thursday. So thank you very much.